We now return to the Peter Schiff Show.
Call toll-free 866-226-5620 now.
866-226-5620.
Rebel Radio, the Peter Schiff Show.
Welcome back, everybody. You are listening to the Peter Schiff Show. I now have a guest on the air, Robert Creamer, president of Strategic Consulting Group, blogger from the Huffington Post. He's actually married to Representative Jan Schakowsky. She's a Democrat from Illinois. I guess he's on today because he wrote a piece at the Huffington Post, which I happened to read, I don't know, about an hour and a half ago. And first of all, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong. The basic premise of your piece is that taxes on wealthy people don't hurt the economy. And in fact, taxing wealthy people might actually help the economy because the wealthy people, rather than spending their money, might save or invest that money, and that savings and investment is somehow negative for the economy. And if we can take that money away and stop them from saving it and investing it and give it to the government so that the government can spend it, that this is going to be better for the economy. Did I get that right?
I wouldn't frame it up quite that way, but the bottom line is accurate. Yes, I think that tax cuts for the rich are basically hurt the economy, both from the point of view of draining funds from the public sector that are necessary to assure prosperity over the long haul, and from the standpoint of the extent to which they exacerbate the tendency of the very small percentage of the population to control more and more wealth, which is a huge problem in our current economy for any kind of long-term.
Well, before I get into that, I want to kind of go back to the beginning of your article, at least from memory, and just kind of go over some of the pieces of it. Because first off, I think early on you go back to the period of time right after the Second World War, when we had a lot of economic growth. And you also point out that we had a very high marginal tax rate at that time. I think the top rate was 90%. Now, is it your point that the 90% tax rate caused that economic growth, or that it didn't prevent it from happening?
No, I think that is intended to respond to the claim that high marginal taxes on wealthy people somehow stifle economic growth, and it's quite clear in that period that was not the case.
All right, but are you looking at any other factors? Is it possible that had tax rates been lower, that we would have even had more robust growth?
Well, I don't find any evidence from economic history to justify the notion that lower marginal tax rates for the wealthy boost economic growth. I take essentially the same position that Warren Buffett does, which is that those reductions in tax rates don't have a particularly beneficial impact.
Yeah.
And because they drain money from everybody else and from the public sector, they have a negative impact.
Well, they don't. What happens is that the tax increases drain money from the private sector and divert it to the public sector. But let me go back to the Second World War, because the reason that we had all this economic growth following the end of the Second World War was because government spending collapsed and resources that were used to fight the war were freed up for civilian purposes. And we had tremendous economic growth despite the fact that we did have higher marginal tax rates. But there's something you got to understand about those 90% taxes. Nobody paid them. The government didn't collect any revenue. See, back then, the income tax was very different than it is today. There were so many deductions, there were so many loopholes, that the rich actually paid lower taxes under a 90% regime than a lot of them pay today. So it was because they were able to avoid those levels of taxes that the high taxes didn't interfere with the economic growth. Because believe me, if people actually had to pay 90% of their income in taxes, there would have been no growth. I mean, no one in their right mind would work for 10 cents on the dollar. I mean,
well, when you say people, we're talking about a very narrow strata of people, the very wealthy people in society.
But they didn't pay 90% of their income in taxes. Nobody did.
No, of course.
Because they avoided the taxes with all kinds of loopholes, so nobody actually paid them. So it's actually not a good comparison to say that 90% tax rates didn't hurt when that was an illusion. Nobody paid those taxes to begin with. But let's go forward in time to kind of a closer comparison, because then you talk about, what you contrast the Clinton era with the Bush era, right? And you point out correctly that under Clinton, taxes were raised.
Correct.
And then you say but we had a good economy under Clinton, correct?
And that subsequently, I mean, he left George Bush a surplus as far as the eye could see, and an economy that was had been essentially the best economy in human history in the United States.
All right, so let me just assault that premise for a second. It's my contention that we did not have a good economy under Clinton. We had a bubble. We had a stock market bubble that was caused by the Fed. Because the Fed kept interest rates too low, it inflated the stock market bubble. It was the malinvestments of the stock market bubble that created the illusion of economic growth during the 1990s. It took place despite the fact that Clinton raised taxes. Now, what Bush inherited from Clinton was the bursting of that bubble. And in 2001, we would have had a substantial recession, much worse than the recession that we did have, had the Federal Reserve not come to the rescue with 1% interest rates and the housing bubble. So the housing bubble was inflated by the Fed to counteract the damage caused by the stock market bubble under Clinton. Now, Bush comes in. Yes, Bush cut taxes. Probably the only decent thing he did was reduce taxes on dividend income. I mean, most of what Bush did I was opposed to, but that he did right. But we had a phony economy under Bush for the same reason we had a phony economy under Clinton. And when you talk about the collapse that we had in 2008 because of what happened under Bush, that's the same collapse we had in 2001. The reason it was bigger in 2008 is because we had a bigger bubble under Bush than we had under Clinton, but that was all the Fed's doing.
I entirely agree with you with respect to the Clinton period. I will say this, though. I mean, they're obviously the bubble contributed in nice. It contributed enormously in the next period. But the bottom line premise of those who wanted to cut taxes and reduce regulation is that those two single acts will spur economic growth. We had an experiment that lasted 8 years under the Bush administration in those two principles, and they failed miserably.
Well, but they failed miserably because of the other factors that were involved. You see, I was very critical of the monetary and fiscal policy under the Bush administration the whole time. See, we didn't – what we really need when you cut taxes, you can't just keep spending money because borrowing is worse than taxing. I will agree with one thing, that funding the government with borrowing is worse than funding the government through taxation. And the reason is, and it kind of is opposite of what you're saying, when the government taxes money, right, some of that money would have been spent, right? Not all of it would have been invested. And it's taking away investment capital that kills the economy. But when the government borrows money, when it goes into the capital markets and borrows money to finance spending, 100% of that borrowed money reduces capital investment. And so it's the worst way to pay for government. It's the single most destructive way. So if you're going to say, hey, under the Bush years, we cut taxes, but we increased the deficits, it's not the lower taxes that created the problem. It's the fact that we borrowed money to pay for government spending. Had we cut government spending in line with the reduction of taxes, we would have had a very different outcome.
Look, the fundamental problem with our economy in the 2000s and frankly even today is the lack of demand, not having a difficult time getting supply of investment.
No, it was actually the reverse.
People will invest if they have the opportunity to make some money, and if demand collapses, that's what causes the fundamental problem.
Look, if you go back to the 2000s,
profits in the history of the United States, just reported today, and
but if you're going to try to say that we didn't have demand during the 2000s, we had record trade deficits. We spent like drunken sailors. We bought everything under the sun. Americans bought all kinds of gasmet. We got plasma TVs, laptops. We remodeled our houses. We demanded everything. We spent like drunken sailors. How could you say there was no demand? The problem was there was no supply. We had to import all that stuff.
No, the problem was that average people's incomes were stagnant through the entire period, so it was all financed on a credit bubble that was borrowed from China.
Well, there you go. But why were people's incomes?
There was not real demand. There was not demand in the economic sense that people had money in their pockets to lay out.
Right, but why was income growth stagnant? What was preventing